The children were not lost, they were taken. All 7, the same way. What remained was not a body, it was an arrangement. My name is Alasdair Grier MacPhail. I was 34 years of age in the autumn of 1894, and I held the position of field investigator for the Crown Office of the Lord Advocate for Scotland, attached to the Northern Circuit and operating under the authority of Procurator Fiscal James Renwick Holt of Inverness. My function was to attend scenes that local constabulary had determined to be beyond their competence, to compile evidentiary records in sufficient detail for prosecution, and to transmit those records to the court with my professional assessment of their nature and probable cause. I had done this work for 9 years. I had attended drownings, farm accidents, 3 mine collapses, and 1 episode of mass poisoning in Dingwall that had taken 4 lives and was eventually attributed to contaminated well water. I was not a man who frightened easily, and I had trained myself, through long practice, to see what was in front of me before I decided what it meant. That discipline served me well in every investigation I had previously undertaken. In the valley of Glen Dub, in the final weeks of October 1894, it collapsed entirely. What follows is my official account, submitted to Fiscal Holt and thereafter sealed by his personal order, which I now consider to have been a profound mistake. What is sealed cannot warn anyone. I am writing this second record for a different purpose. The village of Ardlachie sat at the head of the glen, 41 miles southeast of Inverness by road, and perhaps a third of that in direct measure across the hills, which in that country means nothing practical, because the hills are not passable hills, but rather dense and indifferent obstacles of heather and scree and bog that would take a horse's leg as readily as it would take a man's. The glen itself was 4 miles long and less than a mile wide at its broadest, running roughly northeast to southwest between 2 ridge lines of moderate height, but severe character, their faces dark and almost vertical in places, cut through in the upper portions by seams of pale granite that showed like old scars. The River Dub, which gave the place its name, ran along the eastern margin of the glen floor, and was black in the way that highland streams are black, which is to say dark amber over dark peat, but deep enough in the central channel that it read as black from any distance. The smell of the place, which I noted in my field book on the first afternoon, was heather and peat smoke and something else, something beneath those 2 familiar highland smells, something that I initially attributed to a dead animal somewhere above the track, because it had that sweetness that carrion develops in the cold, but carried into it a secondary quality that I could only describe, then and now, as old iron, like the inside of a toolbox left wet over a winter. I could not locate its source. The smell was present one moment and absent the next, with no correlation I could identify to wind direction or proximity to anything specific. It did not behave the way smells behave. I arrived on the 14th of October, having traveled from Inverness by coach to the market town of Morvern, and then by hired cart along the Glen track. My driver, a young man named Donald Urquhart, who said nothing of consequence during the 4 hours of our journey, and who, when I attempted to discuss the reason for my visit, became interested in the road ahead with an intensity that seemed to preclude all other thought. I had received the initial report from the local constable, a man named Sergeant Ewan Tulloch of the Ross Shire Constabulary, who had himself written to Fiscal Holt in terms of considerable agitation, which was unusual for a sergeant of his tenure, and which was part of the reason Holt had dispatched me personally rather than delegating to a junior investigator. The report stated that 6 children between the ages of 4 and 11 had disappeared from the village and its surrounding farmsteads over a period of 6 weeks, beginning in early September. Their disappearances shared 3 documented features. Each had occurred between the hours of dusk and full dark. Each child had last been seen within 200 yards of the cave system that opened on the eastern ridge face above the northern end of the village, and each disappearance had been preceded, according to multiple witnesses, by a sound that the witnesses described with remarkable consistency as a long, low exhalation, like wind through a bottle neck but much larger, and with a second tone underneath it, harmonizing, as one woman put it, like a choir of one. A seventh child, a girl of 9 named Maisie Drummond, had been reported missing on the 12th of October, 2 days before my arrival. It was her disappearance that had prompted Tulloch to mark his letter urgent. Tulloch met me at the single inn the village possessed, which was also the post office and the general store, and appeared to serve additionally as the informal headquarters of whatever community governance Ardlachie had managed to assemble for itself over the preceding century. He was a large man in his middle 50s, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, with the kind of face that had spent decades practicing a neutral expression and had gotten very good at it. He shook my hand and offered me tea, and waited until Donald Urquhart had left the room before speaking, and when he spoke he did not begin with the children. He began with the cave. The system had 2 known entrances, he told me, both on the eastern ridge face, one at an elevation of perhaps 300 feet above the glen floor, and one lower, closer to the tree line that fringed the base of the ridge. The lower entrance was the one the children knew. It was the one they had played near for as long as anyone in the village could remember, and for as long as anyone could remember nothing had come out of it that was not the wind. He had explored the lower section himself, he said, 20 years ago as a young constable newly posted to the area, and he had gone perhaps 150 feet inside before his lamp began to falter and he turned back. He had found nothing of note, narrow passages, some chambers of moderate size, limestone formations, the ordinary contents of an unremarkable cave system of the type common to that region. He paused here. His hands, which had been flat on the table, came together and folded. He said that what had changed, in his considered opinion, was not the cave. What had changed was what was in it now. I asked him what he believed was in it. He looked at me for a moment with an expression that had nothing neutral about it. Then he said that he was not prepared to state a belief, but only an observation, and the observation was that on 3 separate occasions over the preceding month he had found tracks at the lower entrance that he could not account for, and that he had measured carefully and recorded in his own field notes. He produced those notes. The impressions were bipedal, he had determined, meaning that whatever made them moved on 2 limbs, and not 4, and they were arranged in a walking pattern rather than a galloping or bounding pattern. But the stride length was wrong for a man, being 4 inches from heel strike to heel strike, which would require a man of perhaps 8 feet in standing height to produce naturally. And the width of the foot, measured at its broadest point, was 11 inches, and the individual toe impressions, where they were clear in softer ground, numbered not 5 but 6, and the outermost 2 on each side were separated from the central cluster by a gap he estimated at 2 inches. He had not reported these measurements to Holt. He had not reported them to anyone. He showed them to me, because I was from the Crown Office, and because he needed someone to tell him what he was looking at. I looked at his diagrams for a long time. My professional training encompassed a good deal of natural history, and I had studied track patterns as part of my general education. I could not tell him what he was looking at. I told him I would need to see the site. The men of the village, I discovered over the course of that first afternoon, would not look directly at the ridge. It was not obvious. If you were not watching for it, you would not notice. But I was watching for it, because Tulloch had mentioned it in passing, almost as an embarrassment, and once he mentioned it I could not stop noticing it. a farmer named Callum Ross, who had lost his youngest son in the second week of September, and who spoke to me with a flatness of effect that I recognized as grief compressed into something functional by necessity. Gave me his account of that evening with his eyes oriented to a point on the floor between us, and at no point during our conversation did his gaze move toward the eastern window, which gave a clear view of the ridge face. His wife, who brought us tea and who stood in the doorway while he spoke, faced entirely the other direction, toward the interior of the house. An older man whose name I did not get, who was present in the inn when I returned that evening, and who seemed inclined to speak to me until another man touched his sleeve, began a sentence that started with the words, "There is a thing in that hill that is not," and then stopped. Just stopped, as though the sentence had run into a wall. He looked at the man who had touched his sleeve, and then he looked at me, and then he picked up his glass and finished it and left the inn. The man who had touched his sleeve did not look at me at all. I went to the lower cave entrance on the morning of the 15th with Tulloch and a lamp and my field kit. The weather had turned overnight, and the ridge face was slick with mist, the heather dark and heavy with water, and the track up from the village was a series of muddy ledges that required both hands at intervals. Tulloch was quieter than he had been indoors. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had decided how he wanted to conduct himself and was maintaining that decision against some internal resistance. The entrance, when we reached it, was a horizontal crack in the limestone face, roughly oval in cross-section, perhaps 6 feet high at its greatest and perhaps 4 feet across, widening as it receded into the darkness. The ground before it was a shelf of soft red clay that held impressions exceptionally well. There were tracks, not Tulloch's measurements from 3 weeks previous, new ones, made within the last 48 hours, I estimated, given the current moisture level and the way the clay had settled back at the margins of the impressions. I crouched over them and took out my measuring tape and spent 20 minutes with my field book while Tulloch held the lamp and said nothing. The measurements matched his: 53 inches of stride, 11 inches of foot breadth, 6'2" impressions. But there was one detail he had not recorded, or had not been able to record from previous visits. In the central chamber of each heel impression, clearly visible in the clay, there was a second smaller depression, rounded and regular, approximately 3 inches in diameter, which appeared in every track at precisely the same relative position, approximately 2 inches forward of the heel center. My first thought was that this represented a walking aid of some kind, a staff or stick. My second thought, which arrived immediately, and which I did not write in my field book, was that the secondary depression was too regular, too perfectly consistent, and positioned in a way that suggested it was part of the foot, rather than a separate object. This second thought I set aside and did not return to that day. Inside the entrance, at a distance of approximately 10 feet from the cave mouth, where the passage bent to the left, and the daylight no longer reached, there was a smell. It hit at the threshold of the bend, abruptly, without transition, as though it occupied a defined space. It was layered. The dominant note was animal musk, dense and musky and warm, the kind of smell that a large, warm, blooded animal produces when confined in an enclosed space. And underneath that was the sweet, iron quality I had detected in the open air the day before, but concentrated here to a degree that was almost physical, a taste as much as a smell, something I felt behind my molars and in the roof of my sinuses simultaneously. Beneath both of these was a third element that I struggled to name and eventually described in my field book as organic decomposition, but not putrefaction, closer to the smell of meat that has been dried rather than rotted, jerked, or cured, but without the smoke. Tulloch made a sound in his throat when we hit it. I made no note of that in my field book either. We did not go further. On the night of the 16th, lying on the narrow bed in the inn's single-guest room, with the lamp low and the window shuttered against the wet wind off the ridge, I heard it for the first time. It came after midnight, I believe, though I could not be certain, because I had been drifting between sleep and wakefulness for what felt like a long time, and my sense of duration was unreliable. It began as a vibration rather than a sound, a quality in the air that I became aware of through the bones of my jaw before I could identify it as auditory, a sustained resonance that I initially thought was wind in the chimney because the storm had not fully abated. But then the harmonic overtone arrived, the second tone underneath the primary, and it was not wind. Wind does not harmonize with itself in a structured interval. This was structured. The lower tone sat a fifth below the upper one, a specific musical relationship, and both tones were produced with a breath control that implied a respiratory volume I could not reconcile with any animal I was able to name. It lasted approximately 40 seconds. It came from the direction of the ridge. Then it stopped, and after it stopped, there was a silence of a different quality from the silence that had preceded it, a silence with a presence to it, a silence that felt occupied. I lay in that bed with my hands at my sides and my eyes on the ceiling, and I told myself the sound was natural, geological, a resonating cave passage responding to wind pressure in some configuration I had not encountered before. I told myself this for approximately 3 hours. At some point before dawn, I fell asleep. When I woke, the shutters were intact, and nothing was outside the window, and I had no reason, in the technical sense, to believe otherwise. This did not make me feel as I expected it would. On the 17th, 2 things happened. In the morning, Callum Ross came to the inn and told me that his eldest daughter, Kirsten, aged 13, had not come inside at dusk the previous evening. He had not reported this to Tulloch yet because he had spent the night searching. He had found nothing. He told me this in the same flat, functional voice he had used when describing his son. And I understood then that this man had entered a territory of grief so total that it had taken on the character of landscape, something he simply now inhabited. And the only thing I could do for him in that moment was to write down what he said exactly as he said it, and treat it with the absolute seriousness it deserved. In the afternoon, I found the arrangement. It was Tulloch who showed it to me, and it was on the shelf of clay before the cave entrance, which we had not examined beyond the immediate area of the tracks on our previous visit. At the left margin of the shelf, in a shallow natural depression in the rock where the cliff face met the clay, there were objects arranged with a deliberateness that was impossible to mistake for anything else. 14 white stones, each roughly the size of a clenched fist, placed in a double row with precise equal spacing, and at the end of the rows, centered, a single object that was not a stone. It was a child's boot, leather ankle high, with 3 brass eyelets on the left side. Tulloch recognized it. It had belonged to a boy named Fergus Macmillan, aged 7, the 3rd child to disappear, who had gone missing on the 22nd of September. The boot was clean. Not clean as though it had been washed, but clean as though it had been placed there recently and had not been rained upon, which was significant, because it had rained heavily on the 15th and the 16th, and the clay around the stones was marked with rain impact, while the stones themselves showed no such marking. The arrangement had been made after the rain, within the last 24 hours. Whatever had made the tracks had come out during the night, moved along the shelf, and arranged these objects. I stood in front of them for a long time. My hands were not quite steady when I recorded the measurements and the relative positions in my field book. I recorded this fact, in the margin, in smaller writing than my usual hand. I could not account for it professionally, and I included it for completeness. I sent Tulloch to Inverness for additional constables and a rifle. I want to be precise about this. I am not a hunter, and I had not gone to Ardlachie expecting to need a firearm. I carried a service revolver, standard issue, and I was competent with it at close range. But competence at close range was not what the situation appeared to require, and I was honest enough with myself to recognize that fact and act on it. Tulloch was gone for 2 days. In those 2 days I spoke to every adult in the village who would speak to me, and I compiled a record that I will not reproduce here in full, because it covers 63 pages of close handwriting and is part of the sealed record that Holt has locked in his office. But the relevant common elements were as follows. The sound preceded each disappearance by 1 or 2 nights. Each disappearance occurred when a child was alone outside and within sight of the cave entrance. And every adult in the village except Tulloch had heard the sound on multiple occasions, and not one of them had gone outside to investigate, which I did not judge them for, because I had heard it once and I had not gone to the window. There was also one additional piece of testimony, provided by an elderly woman named Morag Gillies, who had lived in the glen for her entire 78 years, and who, unlike the others, looked directly at me when she spoke and did not stop mid-sentence. She told me that her grandmother had known this thing, had called it by a name that translated roughly from the Gaelic as the Hollow One, and had described it as a creature that had been in the hill longer than anyone could measure, that came out in the dark seasons, that was drawn to the voices of children, because children's voices carried a pitch, that it found useful in some way she could not explain, but that her grandmother had described as the way a key fits a lock. Morag told me this without drama. She told me that it collected. She told me that the things it collected it did not eat. I asked her what it did with them. She held my gaze for a moment and then said that it kept them. I wrote this down. I did not ask what she meant by kept. I was not entirely sure I wanted the answer. Tulloch returned on the evening of the 19th with 2 constables and a sporting rifle and 2 boxes of cartridges. He also brought, uninvited and unexpected, a man named Reverend Duncan Strath of the Free Church of Scotland, who had apparently attached himself to the party at Morvern with the stated intention of providing pastoral support. Strath was in his 40s, lean and certain in the manner of men who have organized their entire character around a point of faith and find the organization comfortable. He annoyed me in the precise way that certainty annoys uncertainty, but I was glad of his company in the manner that I would have been glad of the company of anyone additional who was prepared to stand upright in that village after dark. We held a brief council in the inn. I laid out what I knew and what I had measured, and what I could not explain, and I told them my plan, which was simple and not good, and was the only plan available. We would go to the cave entrance at last light, and we would go inside, and we would go as far as it was possible to go, because Kirsten Ross had been missing for 2 days, and 8 children were gone, and I was not prepared to leave this investigation in the condition it was in. Tulloch had the rifle. The 2 constables named Fraser and Bain, young men both, had their service revolvers. I had mine. Strath had a Bible and a lantern, and he asked if he might come with us, and I said yes, because I needed the light. We went up the track at 4 in the afternoon on the 20th of October, which gave us approximately an hour of usable daylight, and after that we would depend on the lanterns. The temperature had dropped sharply. The mist had cleared and the air was still and very cold, and carried that sweet, iron smell from the first moment we cleared the village. Stronger now. More insistent. Fraser noticed it at the base of the track and looked at me. I told him it was mineral, which was not technically a lie, because I could not determine what it was technically. Bain said nothing. He was watching the cave entrance, which was visible from the track below as a dark oval in the pale limestone, and he was watching it in the way that people watch things they would prefer to stop watching but cannot. I understood the feeling. The clay shelf was empty when we arrived. The arrangement of stones and the boot had been removed. I had photographed them, so the record exists. But standing on that shelf with the cave mouth open before us and the objects gone, I felt the absence of them as something close to relief, and then something closer to dread. Because whatever had placed them had also unmade them, and that movement in the interim, that activity was its own kind of information. Tulloch chambered around. We went in. The first 60 feet were as he had described his original exploration: narrow passage, pale stone walls slick with moisture, the floor uneven but navigable. The smell grew with every step, not gradually, in surges, as though we were passing through sequential thresholds of concentration. At the 60-foot mark, the passage opened abruptly into a chamber that was large enough that the lanterns did not fully illuminate it. The ceiling above us in darkness, the walls to either side at the margins of visibility. The chamber floor was relatively flat and had a surface that I cannot describe as entirely natural because it had been modified. The larger projections of stone broken away in a pattern that seemed purposeful rather than accidental, creating something close to a level floor across an area of perhaps 30 feet in diameter. And on this floor, arranged along the far wall in a row with the same precise equal spacing as the stones on the clay shelf outside, were objects. I moved the lantern forward and counted them. I recognized what they were. Shoes. Children's shoes. Not just the 7 who had disappeared from Ardlachie. Far more than 7. I counted before I stopped counting. Because I had to stop at 30, 2, and the row continued into the darkness beyond what the lantern reached. Tulloch made a sound I had not previously heard from him. Constable Bain said Jesus Christ very quietly, and I did not correct him, because it was the most accurate thing anyone had said since I arrived in the glen. Then we heard the sound. Not from outside, from above. I will tell you what it was like to hear it in that chamber. The primary tone hit the chest before the ears, a bass resonance that the sternum conducted inward, so that the first perception was interior, vibrational, as though the sound were originating from somewhere inside the body. The overtone arrived a fraction of a second later, and it was the second tone. The harmonizing fifth, that engaged the more primitive parts of the brain, because it was in a frequency range that the body interprets as a signal, as a warning issued by something large enough to produce it. The combined effect on me was that my legs underwent a sensation that I can only describe as a brief structural uncertainty, a moment in which they did not quite belong to me. Before my training and my will reasserted themselves, and I took hold of that lantern and kept it steady. I was proud of that. In this moment I remain proud of it. It is a small thing to be proud of. Something was coming down from above. Strath raised the lantern higher, and the ceiling emerged from darkness in sections, and what came down did not use the passage we had used. It came through a crack in the upper wall of the chamber, a vertical fissure I had not seen, and it came through it with a fluency that was the first wrong thing, because the fissure was perhaps 18 inches wide, and what passed through it occupied a space considerably larger than that on both sides of the transit, and yet the transit was continuous, without pause, as though the breadth of its body was a negotiable rather than a fixed property. It landed on the chamber floor 30 feet from us, with a weight that I felt through the soles of my boots, a concussive impact that traveled up through my legs and into my spine. It straightened. Its head cleared the darkness at the chamber ceiling's edge, which put it at somewhere between 10 and 11 feet in standing height. It was bipedal, and it stood with a forward lean that was severe, the upper body inclined perhaps 30 degrees from vertical, the arms hanging forward and very long. The knuckle clearance from the ground perhaps 8 inches, when it stood fully extended, which was not often, because the normal resting position involved a partial crouch that dropped the shoulders and brought the hanging hands closer to the floor. The forward lean gave it the profile of something perpetually prepared to fall, and the movement wrongness was exactly that watching it walk. Later, when it moved across the chamber, I could identify what disturbed me about it, which was that the knees bent too little, and the forward inclination of the body was doing the work of momentum that the legs should have been doing, so that each step was a controlled forward fall arrested by the next footfall, and the rhythm of it was slightly too fast. The pace mechanical in a way that suggested it had learned locomotion by observation and reproduction, rather than by the developmental processes that calibrate it over years of childhood growth. It had watched something walk and reproduced the mechanics without the instinct. The surface of it was not fur and not skin in any sense I was prepared for. It was a dense, close covering of something that absorbed the lantern light almost entirely, giving it a quality of negative darkness. A darkness with volume and presence, the color not black but the absence of color in a way that was distinct from the black of its eye sockets. Up close, when I was later closer than I am even now willing to fully examine in memory, the surface had a grain to it, directional, like the nap of very dense velvet, but the grain ran in multiple competing directions across different parts of the body, as though the covering had been assembled from many different pieces, and the seams were not all aligned. The hands, if they could be called that, had the proportions of hands elongated by perhaps a third, the fingers long and ending not in nails, but in the secondary rounded impressions I had recorded in the clay, smooth and hard, calcified. The heel pads of each finger terminating in this rounded cap rather than a claw, which was how it left the secondary depression in each track. It was not a walking aid. It was the anatomy. The face. I will describe the face, because not describing it would be a different kind of dishonesty. The jaw structure was prognathic to a degree beyond what I had seen in any animal, projecting forward and downward, so that the profile showed more jaw than brow, but the brow itself was not absent. It was deep, set, and heavy, and below it the eyes were deep in their sockets, very far apart, oriented more to the sides than the front in the manner of prey animals. Which was wrong, because everything else about it said predator. The eyes themselves were pale, not the glowing yellow or red that folklore assigns to creatures of this kind. Pale gray, opaque, with a quality of depth that was the opposite of reflective, not catching the lantern light but taking it in, drawing it downward into an interior that gave nothing back. And in that paleness was an intelligence that was not the intelligence of an animal calculating its next movement, but something slower and more durable, something that had been watching from a long time, and was still watching and would continue to watch after everything currently in its field of vision had ceased to exist. That was what was in the eyes. The certainty of duration. It looked at us the way a cliff face looks at a wave. Tulloch raised the rifle. I do not know what he was thinking, but the action was professional and composed, and I was grateful for it. He fired twice. Both shots connected. I am certain of it, because the second shot produced a reaction, a sideways recoil of the upper body that was unmistakably a response to physical impact. And the sound the creature produced in that moment was different from the harmonizing call. It was lower and more immediate. A percussion rather than a sustained tone, felt in the teeth and the jaw rather than the sternum, and I felt it in my teeth specifically for the remainder of that night and into the following morning. But it did not fall. It moved, backward and sideways in one motion, toward the far wall, and its hands came down to the floor, and it adopted the walking, fall gait, and it moved toward the fissure, and I made a decision that I cannot fully account for in professional terms, but can account for in the only terms that matter, which is that there were children. There were 30, 2 pairs of shoes plus more. And I was the only member of our party not frozen in place. I ran toward it, toward the fissure, toward the far wall. I do not recommend this. I am recording it because it happened, and omitting it would corrupt the record. I had the revolver in my right hand, and the revolver was relevant in approximately the same way that a stone is relevant to a river, which is to say it displaced something, but did not stop it. The smell at close range was the full composite, musk and iron, and the dried meat sweetness, and underneath those three a fourth element I had not detected at any greater distance. Something that registered not in the nose, but at the back of the throat as a constriction, automatic and muscular, the body deciding before the brain that this proximity was an event requiring physiological response. My hands were cold. The grip of the revolver was cold, and the metal of it felt different from how metal usually feels, too dense, the weight distributed wrong. And I understood that my hands were reporting sensation inaccurately, because they were frightened, and I had no time to negotiate with them. The creature was at the fissure. It looked back, not with the body, not with a turn of the head, with the eyes, which moved in their orbits with a range and independence that was not human, swiveling backward and downward in the socket, so that both pale gray depths oriented on me, without any motion of the neck. It was looking at me while moving away. It held that gaze. Then it went into the fissure, and it was gone, and the fissure was 18 inches wide and silent. I stood in front of the fissure with my revolver pointed at nothing. My breathing was loud in the chamber. Everything else was silent. Then Tulloch said my name, and I turned around, and the other 3 were still alive. And I counted them and confirmed this, and then I looked at the row of children's shoes along the far wall, and my breathing did not change and my hands did not change, and this was not bravery, but shock, which presents similarly and should not be confused with it. We found 2 children alive in a passage off the eastern wall of the chamber. They were Kirsten Ross and a boy named Hamish Brodie, who had disappeared 6 weeks before, and whom the village had assumed was dead. They were cold, and they were not speaking, but they were breathing, and they had been placed, not deposited, placed, in a careful lateral arrangement with their heads on a raised shelf of stone and their hands at their sides. They did not appear to have been harmed physically in any way that my examination could identify. Kirsten Ross was the first to speak, approximately an hour after we brought her outside and into the cold air, and what she said was a single repetitive phrase in Gaelic that Tulloch translated for me later, slowly, with a face that I will not describe, because it is not my face to put in this record. She was saying the same thing over and over. She was saying, it was counting us. It was still counting us. She said it for a long time before she stopped. We did not find the other 6 children. Tulloch sealed the cave entrance with timber and stone the following morning, and I submitted my preliminary report to Fiscal Holt, and he read it and sealed it, as I have described, and I returned to Inverness and wrote the supplementary pages, and had them sealed also, and for a period of approximately 8 months, I did not speak of what I had seen in that chamber to any person, because I was a professional, and because the matter had been classified, and because I had made an undertaking, and because none of that, in the end, was sufficient. What broke it was a letter, received in June of 1895, 7 months after my return, forwarded from Fiscal Holt's office with no covering note, postmarked Ardlachie. It contained 4 sentences in a hand I did not recognize. The first 3 sentences asked after my health, commented on the spring weather, and inquired whether I had encountered any interesting cases recently. The 4th sentence was different. It said I counted the shoes last week. There are 39 now. The letter was not signed. I have thought about those 2 additional sets of shoes every day since. I have thought about Kirsten Ross's phrase. I have thought about Morag Gillies telling me that it collected, that it kept. I had assumed, when she said kept, that she meant retained, hoarded, accumulated. I understand now that she did not mean that. Or rather, she meant that. But she meant something additional, something I could have understood if I had been willing to ask the question. I decided not to ask in that dim room in the inn in Ardlachie in October of 1894. To keep is also to tend, to maintain, to return to. What Morag knew, and what she chose to tell me without saying directly, was that the things it collected it did not kill. It maintained them. In the dark. In the passages. In the long cold of the hill. And some part of that maintenance involved a regularity of attendance that she would have called, if pressed, a kind of care, or the closest approximation to care that something without the capacity for it is able to produce by long observation of the thing itself. The two children we found had been placed with their heads elevated and their hands arranged. Placed, not left. 39 shoes along the far wall, spaced with equal precision, maintained in the dark where no human eye would see them. Tended by something that had been counting from a time before anyone in that valley had learned to count. I set this account down. I do not know what to do with the knowledge. No one does. It is still counting.